This is in this session of challenges in practice. Basically, we are looking at the pathogenesis, but the challenge to my mind in practice is first to accept the concept. So we are so reluctant to accept the concept of stress as an important parameter to address. Stress coping is something which we can modify. And in our practice, if we believe this is an important area to dwell upon, whether it is prevention of diabetes or managing diabetes once it has occurred, this becomes an important issue and an important clinical challenge with which we need to familiarize ourselves all the time. Stress and diabetes, we all believed are associated for a very long time, but except for some anecdotal reports, the actual association between the two conditions in terms of evidence has come about only in the last 2 decades. Only in the last 2 decades, there have been several studies which have associated, they've been cross-sectional, and some of them longitudinal as well, which have actually shown stress as an important etiopathogenic factor or a risk factor for the development of type 2 diabetes. Most of these studies, however, have focused on stress and have not talked much about the stress coping part. Although they have measured stress coping, but they have not given time to think or focus about it. Stress coping has been evaluated in several psychological studies, in other contexts, and in other illnesses, and is supposed to be an important element in the pathogenesis and management of several of the psychosomatic disorders, but has been poorly researched in the context of diabetes. We all know that while stress is there everywhere, not everybody who faces stress develops disease, and in particular diabetes. And therefore, there must be some factor which is modifying the effect of stress in its translation to the disease, in this case diabetes. And that's where stress coping comes, and I hope to convince you in the next 15 minutes that this is an important area to understand and maybe strategize in future to prevent and treat diabetes mellitus. This will be based, or the story will evolve out of 3 of our own studies in the last 3, 4, 5 years, where we have actually shown the association in the Indian population between stress and diabetes, and several of the neuroendocrine responses have been worked out. Initially, it was done in salivary cortisol measurements and shown a positive correlation in terms of risk. More recently, this was thought to be mediated through the known oxidative stress and inflammatory pathways with which this chronic stress is supposed to associate and mediate its effects in diabetes risk. And most importantly, in about 1,000 patients whom we studied, we demonstrated very clearly that it was a sense of coherence, and this is what is the coping measure, which I'll talk about in a little more detail, which actually is the most important predictive factor of diabetes risk. And this was again published last year. So out of these would evolve the rest of my talk. These have been the various studies actually over the last 2-3 decades which I was mentioning, where the first 4 actually talk of association between chronic psychological stress and diabetes in cross-sectional studies. Then the self-perceived stress, this concept also has evolved because initially it was thought that the lifetime events or adverse events was enough to define stress. But as days went on, people start realizing that unless you perceive stress in a particular situation, it is of no consequence. There may be an adverse event or a so-called adverse event which may not be adversely perceived. And therefore, perceived stress concepts came about. And then psychosocial stress at work became an important issue, and studies came about in that context. And lastly, there were 2 studies with sense of coherence, one only in the work atmosphere, and of course, there's only one study in a longitudinal way where SOC was measured, not that eloquently, but somewhat, and where they showed a 46% increased risk of diabetes in working male employees, again in the context of work-related stress. Okay, with that background, these 2 slides are the crucial thing to understand. We all are familiar, and the previous talks and probably many more will be based on this concept, the biomedical model of disease. There are several biological factors and there is illness. The 2 are associated. We need to tackle the biological factors, risk reduction, and so on and so forth. Whereas what is more important is the biopsychosocial model, which we don't ever pay attention to, which is not only the biological factors, but also the social factors and the psychological factors. And here we're talking of health and wellness, not disease. These are the factors which define health and wellness, whereas the risk factors was for disease. So we are moving away, and we should be moving away from a disease concept to a health or wellness concept, and that is, in that context, is what is called salutogenesis. Saluto is health and genesis is origins. How do we stay healthy? That should be the focus. And salutogenic approach versus a pathogenic approach. We are obsessed with pathogenic approach without realizing that what is more important is a salutogenic approach, and salutogenic approach compels us to consider formulation of a theory of coping, and in that context, the SOC measure, which we'll talk about, is the most crucial. So what is stress versus stress coping? Quickly, if we go through this, stress is a negative emotional state occurring in response to events that are perceived as taxing or exceeding a person's resources or ability to cope. So when the coping is effective, we adapt and there's no stress. But when the coping is ineffective, then we have the so-called stress-related disease risk. And this is the complex of several behavioral, cognitive, physiological responses which get into the concept of coping, which are all aimed at reducing the harmful effects of the so-called stressor. Now, what is the sense of coherence that we're talking about? The concept of sense of coherence was developed by Antonovsky as a tool to assess unsuccessful or unsuccessful coping. Again, it seeks to explain why some people, despite experiencing major stressors and stressful life events, stay healthy while others develop disease. Persons with a low SOC, so-called, are more likely to deal unsuccessfully with stresses, and therefore they're less likely to meet or cope with stress and develop disease. And this, therefore, could be an important moderator of stress-related diabetes risk as well. It's a global orientation, and the strength of SOC determines whether you will develop disease or you will remain healthy. And in that sense, a strong SOC is salutogenic. And we're going to analyze whether low SOC is associated with diabetes risk. This can be done by a questionnaire. We followed the 13-item questionnaire. And this has been investigated in several contexts and has been validated across the world in several societies, regardless of age, sex, ethnicity, nationality, and study design. It is uniformly effective to measure the coping of an individual. Consists of 3 parts, which we'll not get into. Coming to the risk of diabetes mellitus, there are only few studies have reported that it could moderate or mediated stress-related risk. And the interaction of chronic stress and SOC may be important. Whether SOC moderates or mediates the effect of chronic stress on diabetes risk has not been studied at all before. And that is what we did in this study, which I mentioned in the beginning. There were 1,000 patients, 500 of NGT, 500 of OGTT, determined newly detected diabetes, and we compared several measures, including SOC. And the hypothesis was that people with high stress and low SOC are independently associated with higher risk, and SOC moderates the effects. So this is how they were done. 500 subjects were actually subjected to more than 500. Ultimately, we came up with these 1,000 patients. Stress was comprehensively evaluated by several measures, including the SOC, and the stress response markers of various kinds were also studied in a subset. And the modified version of SOC was used, and that was validated. Now, what were the results? SOC scores were found to be significantly lower in newly detected diabetic mellitus patients. That should begin with. This indicated overall, because stress scores also were high, that those experiencing more stressful life events or major changes in their life and also had a lower coping ability were higher at risk for diabetes. This was the first conclusion. Then there was significant positive correlation of various stress measures with usual risk factors or anthropometric measures and HOMA-IR, HOMA-beta, as we all know. And there was significant inverse correlation of coping scale SOC with glycemic and insulin resistance parameters, and a positive correlation with HOMA-beta, again suggesting that SOC, which is measuring coping, has a very significant role in determining glycemia, insulin resistance, as well as measures of insulin secretion. And this is how the inverse correlation with glycemia has been seen. Further, if you do a logistic regression analysis, there are several factors which have independent predicting value in diabetes. However, the sense of coherence was the strongest independent predictor of diabetes. And an odds ratio of 0.77, that means a 33% lower risk of diabetes if you have a good sense of coherence. And if you divided the entire group into two based on low and high SOC, taking 50th percentile as the cutoff, you would very clearly see that SOC moderates the risk to diabetes. Those with lower SOC are the ones who develop diabetes, and those with higher SOC do not carry that risk of the so-called stress to that extent. Therefore, to summarize, sense of coherence was the strongest independent predictor of diabetes in all these studies, in my study, in several other studies, and it translates to not a 33%, but a 23% lower risk of diabetes. And this points firstly to an independent protective effect of SOC. Now we are not talking of a risk factor, we are talking of protection from risk. So even if you have a risk factor, if you have a good SOC, that protects you against the bad effects of the stress. And our results also support a mediating as well as a moderating effect of SOC on perceived stress scales. However, no such effect was seen in PSLES. So there is an effect, not only direct effect, but also a mediating and a moderating effect of the so-called stress coping in diabetes risk. And the same was seen in the other study, where we included many other risk parameters in the logistic model, including cholesterol, cortisol, and other endocrine risks. Still, the SOC maintained, in fact, increased the risk reduction to 32% now. Even when oxidative stress parameters were included in the model, still SOC continued to have independent effects, suggesting it was a very robust effect, which did not disappear no matter what you added to the model. Hence, we need to conclude and now accept the concept that even in terms of diabetes risk, stress coping is fundamental to determine whether you will have diabetes in the face of a risk factor or a stressor, and you need to evolve strategies to strengthen the coping abilities. We all heard of yoga, but there are several other methods. In fact, many people are focusing, particularly in type 1, in trying to enhance the so-called coping abilities of diabetic patients or those at risk, so that we prevent disease and more effectively manage the diabetic state. The concept of salutogenesis is important in the context of chronic disease, and particularly in diabetes. We need to get away from the usual thought process of disease risk factors, obesity, activity, and so on, and focus more on health maintaining or health promoting measures if we want to make a dent in the diabetes epidemic as a whole. Stress coping is a fundamental principle which underlies salutogenesis and wellness, particularly in the context of stress. We need to understand that. SOC is a valid and robust global measure of measuring this, and we need to relate it. And finally, sense of coherence, which reflects the ability to cope well with stressful situations, is the strongest predictor of diabetes risk among stress-related measures. So if stress is related, then SOC is the most important to handle. Also, this we've already mentioned, and we need to have more prospective studies to confirm this association between stress coping measures and incident diabetes, and I think that should pave the way for a more focused approach and a wider approach to our so-called risk management for preventing diabetes. Thank you.